Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you guys how we can extract a color palette from a video inside of DaVinci Resolve 16 and to use that color palette in other programs such as GIMP. So inside of DaVinci Resolve 16 there is an effect in the effects library, top left hand corner if you need to open that up. You go down to Open Effects, Filters, and under the Resolve Effects Generate category there is a tool called Color Palette. So for the clip you want to generate a color palette for, you need to drag it onto the clip. So you'll see 4 strips of colors at the bottom. The one on the top left over here is for the shadow colors. The middle one is for your mid-range colors. And on the right are your highlight colors. And then the bottom bar is your main colors that take samples from each of those categories. So when you add the color palette effect, you're actually able to modify it a bit. So if you click on the clip and you go over to Open Effects in the inspector, you can change from display mode to shadow region, mid-tone region, or highlight region so that you can see which regions are actually qualifying under those categories. So when you do shadow region, you can see that the trees here and part of the lake are falling into the shadow threshold. So if I want to increase the range or decrease the range of what is considered a shadow in this video clip, then I can drag this bar up and down until we get the value that we want. So next we can click on the display mode, drop down to mid-tone region so that we can see the in-between areas of this footage. And for this you'll be able to see both adjustments to the shadow threshold and the highlight threshold, since the midtones will be whatever falls in between those two regions. So I could increase the highlight threshold if I wanted more of the clouds to be considered midtones, or I can lower this all the way down until there are no clouds whatsoever. Next we can go to the highlight region and you'll be able to see what's considered highlights here, the brightest areas of our video sequence. And so we might decide that we want the whole sky to be considered a highlight threshold. It's really wherever you want to set those values. When you change the shadow threshold and the highlight threshold, and we go back to the color palette, it's actually going to affect what colors show up here. So if I increase the highlight threshold, you'll see that this shifts around the colors that are being selected from our image to generate the color palette. And likewise, if I adjust the shadow threshold, that is going to change the shadows and the mid-tone colors. So I would think a good rule of thumb would be you want to set the shadow threshold and the highlight threshold somewhere where you get a good color variation in all 3 of these categories. So if you notice that by making the shadow threshold way too dark, that there's not much color variation there, you could consider increasing the shadow threshold. And likewise, same idea for the mid-tones and the highlights. And so once we have this color palette generated on screen, unfortunately there doesn't seem to be an export function that I'm aware of yet for directly grabbing these colors out. But what we can do as a workaround is go over to the color tab, and then we take the frame for any frame that we want. Notice how the color palettes are adjusted on a frame by frame basis. So we grab the frame that we want to draw the color palette from. So let's just say there, for instance. And then we can right click on our image here and do grab still, which basically takes like a screenshot of our video clip there with all of the effects layered on top of it, including the color palette generator. So we can now take this generated still, do right click and export, and bring it out as a JPEG. So I'm going to save type as JPEG, we'll call it video color palette, and export it. And now on my desktop, we have that image with the color palette built into the image. So we can take this now in any program like GIMP or Photoshop and start generating the color palette. So I'll go ahead and open GIMP now. And so I'm going to be working on this image, so I'm just going to drag it into GIMP. And so now all we need to do is take the colors from over here and add them to a color palette inside of the palette editor. So for GIMP specifically, the palette editor isn't open by default. You can find it under Windows Duckable Dialogues and then Palettes. In Photoshop, you would probably have a very similar tool. So to create a completely new color palette, I'll go over to the Palettes tab here, and I will click the Create a New Palette button, Lakeside Scene Video Palette, and hit enter. And we can set the number of columns that we want over here. So I will do 4 columns. So that means that it will go 4 across before it jumps down to the next row. But we could actually do 8 columns, which might make even more sense. So each row is one color palette for the shadows, for the midtones, for the highlights, and for the general color palette at the bottom. So now using the color droplet tool over here in the left side, we can select a color, which will immediately become a foreground color, and to add this to the palette, we simply drag this color over, and it will immediately be added to a space. So I do that for each color here, and after a slightly tedious process, we will have a color palette. So we have the shadows done there, and now we just need to repeat process for midtones and highlights. And that's how we do it. So just like that, we now have a 32 color palette generated from one frame of our video, and we could use this to paint with in our GIMP tool. Similar process would apply to Photoshop or painting tool. So that's pretty much all there is to it on how you can create a color palette inside of DaVinci Resolve, extract that out to a JPEG image, and use that to create your final color palette in programs such as GIMP. So I've been Chris. I hope this helped some of you guys out there, and I will see you guys in my future video content.